Inside a packed auction room, laughter erupted when Marcus Reed bid $6,000 on a worthless strip of grass. Bank executive Thomas Whitmore looked him up and down and sneered, "A ditch cleaner like you doesn't belong at a property auction. $6,000? That's your whole life's savings." Investors laughed while Marcus's young daughter watched from the back row. Marcus glanced at her, calmly raised his card one final time, and the gavel came down. 23 years later, that same 12-foot strip would bring the bank's $36 million project to a complete halt. What had Marcus seen that none of them could? Stick around because Marcus's next decision will change everything. If you enjoy stories about quiet people proving their doubters wrong, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's return to that cold morning in March 2001 when no one in the auction room believed Marcus belonged. In the spring of 2001, Marcus Reed was 42 years old and raising his daughter alone in Callaway County, Missouri. His wife Denise had died 2 years earlier after a long illness, leaving him with a 9-year-old girl named Naya and a house that seemed to need something fixed every season. Marcus worked for the county road crew, clearing storm drains, patching potholes, mowing the shoulders of highways, and hauling debris after accidents. It was not the kind of job that earned respect at the bank, and Marcus knew it every time he stood in line to make his mortgage payment, while tellers called the men in suits by their first names and slid his receipt across the counter without looking up. The house he and Naya shared sat at the edge of town, its roof beginning to sag, its heater failing more winters than it worked, and his truck carrying over 200,000 miles on an engine that groaned every time it started. Marcus had no real health coverage through the county, no pension he could count on, and no guarantee his seasonal position would still exist the next time the budget was cut. He carried those worries quietly, the same way he carried almost everything else, without letting Naya see the weight of them. None of that stopped Marcus from noticing things other people missed. Years of clearing ditches and reading survey stakes had taught him how water moved across land, which roads had been planned and abandoned, and how a strip of ground nobody wanted could still control everything around it. He carried that knowledge quietly, the way a man carries something he has not yet found a use for. The men in the suits at the bank never saw him as anything more than a man who fixed roads for a living, and for years Marcus let them believe that was the whole truth. Every month Marcus brought Naya to the public library while she did her homework, and he spent that same hour buried in old zoning maps and county road records. It became a kind of ritual between them, one that neither of them ever spoke about out loud. Naya would spread her workbooks across the table while her father sat a few chairs down with stacks of manila folders the librarian pulled from the archive room, and for an hour every week the two of them worked in a comfortable silence that felt like its own kind of conversation. Once Naya looked up from her books and asked why he spent so much time on papers that looked older than he was. Marcus told her that people with money bought things that already had value, but people without money had to see the value before anyone else did. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she remembered it the same way children remember the things their parents say without explanation, filing them away for later. Before she died, Denise had given Marcus a fireproof box to keep the family's important papers. She told him that they didn't have much, so whatever belonged to this family had to be protected carefully with real proof behind it. Marcus placed the box on the top shelf of the closet and rarely opened it, but her words stayed with him longer than almost anything else she ever said. It was in one of those library sessions that Marcus found a 1956 plan for the expansion of State Route 9. Tucked into the margins of the old survey was a strip of land 12 feet wide and nearly half a mile long running along the eastern side of the highway. The county had set it aside for the expansion, giving it its own tax parcel number, its own boundary description, and its own separate ownership. The plan itself had been abandoned in 1961, but nobody had ever bothered to dissolve the parcel. It simply sat there in the records, forgotten, listed under the name Parcel 7C. On its own, the strip was almost useless. It was too narrow to build a house on, too thin for a store, too awkward for farming or parking. But east of State Route 9 lay hundreds of acres of flat, open land, and the county's water and sewer lines were slowly being extended in that direction. Marcus understood that if that land was ever developed, the most direct access from the highway would almost certainly have to cross Parcel 7C. He didn't know who might build there, or whether it would happen in 5 years or 20 or never. He only knew that the strip was not as worthless as it looked on paper. Around that same time, Callaway Community Bank announced an auction of foreclosed and surplus properties, and Parcel 7C was buried in the list. The bank had no project planned on that side of the highway. They simply wanted to stop paying taxes and maintenance costs on a sliver of land that produced nothing. Marcus knew this was not a safe bet by any measure, but he also understood that the value of Parcel 7C had nothing to do with what could be built on it, and everything to do with what would one day be forced to pass through it. The auction took place on a cold morning in March.
Marcus brought Nia with him, dressed in the cleanest shirt he owned, though the collar had gone soft with age and his work boots still carried stains from the road that no amount of scrubbing could lift. The moment he walked through the door, a bank employee pointed him toward a side entrance and told him maintenance staff used the service door. Marcus held up his registration card and said he was there to bid on property, not fix anything. The man looked at the card, then at Marcus, as if the two things could not possibly belong to the same person. Inside the auction room, investors in tailored suits filled the front rows, while Marcus and Nia were directed to the back, near the exit, close enough to hear everything, but far enough to feel like an afterthought. A server carrying a tray of coffee walked past them twice without offering either of them a cup, and Marcus noticed the way conversation seemed to pause slightly whenever he shifted in his seat, as though the room were keeping track of him without wanting to admit it. Only one person showed any kindness that morning. Evelyn Price, an older woman who worked in the bank's records department, quietly set a glass of water in front of Nia without saying a word and without joining the laughter that would come later. When Marcus stepped up to register his bid, he was asked a second time to prove he could pay in cash, even though none of the other buyers had been asked twice. Thomas Whitmore, then 35 years old and serving as the bank's assistant director of property assets, looked over Marcus's $6,000 cashier's confirmation and said the auction ran on cash only and the bank did not offer payment plans for seasonal laborers. Marcus answered simply that he already knew that. When Parcel 7C came up for bid, it opened at $4,000 and no one in the room showed any interest. Marcus raised his card and said $4,000. A man near the coffee table offered $5,000, clearly just to entertain himself, and Marcus raised again, $6,000. The room went quiet for a moment before the laughter started. Thomas walked toward him and asked if he really intended to spend his entire savings on a 12-foot strip of grass. One of the board members nearby said maybe the man thought owning a few feet of dirt would make him a gentleman, and someone else added that tomorrow he would still be back cleaning ditches for the county. Marcus let it pass over him, but then Thomas turned toward Nia and said a responsible father would use $6,000 to give his daughter a better life. That line landed harder than anything else said in the room. Marcus looked at his daughter and thought about everything that money could fix, from the roof over their heads to the truck that barely started most mornings, to the kind of head start on her education he had never been able to give her. For a moment, his hand holding the auction card began to lower. Nia did not understand what was happening around her. She only saw her father standing in a room full of people laughing, and she was watching him, not the auction. Marcus understood in that instant that she was not just witnessing a purchase, she was learning how a man responds when a room full of strangers tells him he doesn't belong in it. He raised the card again. My bid is still $6,000. Thomas smiled thinly and said fixing roads for people who owned land did not mean Marcus understood real estate. Marcus looked directly at him and said his daughter was watching, and he would not teach her that a man has to leave a room just because the people inside it think he doesn't belong there. The laughter thinned out. The gavel came down. Marcus had won. As the bank's representative, Thomas signed the transfer deed, the survey, the boundary description addendum, and the title warranty for Parcel 7C, sliding the paperwork across the table with one final comment telling Marcus not to come back complaining once he realized he had bought himself a problem. Marcus picked up the folder and told him he would not be coming back to blame anyone. Then he added one more line before walking away. Someday, Thomas would be the one coming to find him. The room laughed again, but Marcus barely heard it this time. He drove home with Nia in the passenger seat, the folder of documents resting on her lap like something fragile, and neither of them said much during the ride. Once inside, Marcus pulled Denise's fireproof box down from the closet shelf for the first time in longer than he could remember, and placed the deed, the survey, and the title warranty inside it, right next to the folded photographs and the handwritten letters his wife had left behind. Nia studied the map for a moment and asked what exactly they had just bought. Marcus pointed to the narrow strip marked Parcel 7C and told her it was a door. When she asked where the door led, he admitted that right now it didn't lead anywhere at all. He closed the box and told her that was exactly why they would have to wait. And as he set the box back on its shelf, he allowed himself just for a moment to wonder how long that waiting might actually take. Years passed without a single sign that Parcel 7C would ever matter to anyone but Marcus. He kept working the same road crew shifts, picking up extra hours whenever the county offered them, patching his own roof with materials he could afford, and mowing the narrow strip of grass twice a year just to keep the weeds down. His truck kept breaking down, and he kept borrowing a neighbor's when it did. Every tax bill for the parcel went into Denise's fireproof box, stacking up year after year like a quiet record of patience nobody else could see.
Around town, people started calling it Marcus's strip of grass, usually with a laugh attached. A few coworkers on the road crew liked to greet him by asking how the real estate empire was coming along, and Marcus usually smiled and let it go. But some nights, driving home to a house that still leaked when it rained hard enough, he found himself wondering whether the men laughing at him might actually be right. There were mornings when Marcus stood at the edge of the parcel with a mower in hand, looking out at the flat, undeveloped land stretching east toward nothing in particular, and asked himself honestly whether he was a patient man or simply a stubborn one. He never fully answered the question. He only kept mowing, kept paying the taxes, and kept telling himself that the day the land finally mattered would arrive on its own schedule, not his. Some years he almost forgot why he had bought it in the first place, and only the sight of the fireproof box on the closet shelf reminded him. In 2007, Thomas Whitmore became president of Callaway Community Bank and started a development arm called Heritage Development Partners. The new company began quietly buying up land east of State Route 9, parcel by parcel, without any public announcement of what it might eventually become. Thomas did not need Parcel 7C yet, and he was in no hurry. He assumed that sooner or later a man with a mortgage and a maintenance job would sell, rather than keep holding on to something that produced no income at all. That assumption got its first real test in 2010, when a severe storm tore a section off the roof and left water pouring straight into Nia's bedroom. Marcus and his daughter spent that spring setting out buckets under the ceiling every time it rained, watching the stains spread across the plaster, while Nia, still just a teenager, then learned to fall asleep to the sound of dripping water. Thomas showed up not long after with an offer of $40,000 for the parcel, more than enough to replace the roof, fix the truck, and put a real dent in the mortgage. Marcus turned him down. Thomas looked at the sagging ceiling and the water-stained walls and told him he was letting his daughter sleep under a leaking roof just to hold on to a strip of grass, and that was not vision, that was foolishness. Marcus asked him plainly why, if the land was worthless, the bank kept offering him money for it. Thomas had no answer for that, and he left without one, though the question clearly stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. That night, Marcus sat alone under the same leaking roof, holding Thomas's business card in his hand. He picked up the phone and dialed the bank's number, listening to it ring once before he set the receiver back down. He looked over at Denise's fireproof box sitting on the shelf and put the card away instead. It was the closest he ever came to selling in those early years, and he never told Nia how close it had actually been. By 2015, Nia had been accepted into law school, but did not have enough financial aid to cover it, leaving her facing either a deferral or a mountain of debt she wasn't sure she wanted to carry. Heritage Development Partners returned with an offer of $150,000, and this time Thomas made sure both father and daughter were sitting in his office when he laid the contract on the desk. His tone carefully rehearsed for the moment. He told Nia that her father could solve her future today if he would just stop pretending to be an investor. Marcus refused to sign.
On the drive home, Naya's anger finally broke loose, the kind that had clearly been building for years rather than minutes. She told him he had let people call him a fool for 14 years, and now she wanted her to carry debt just so he could one day prove them wrong. Marcus tried to explain that the parcel could give their family real long-term security, but Naya cut through that argument without hesitation. She told him she needed him to believe in her future right now, not in a future that only existed on his maps. Marcus didn't know how to put his deepest fear into words, so instead of explaining it, he simply repeated that it was not the right time to sell. To Naya, that answer only confirmed what she already suspected, that the land mattered more to him than she did. She took out student loans, picked up extra work, and moved out on her own within a few months, packing her room into boxes while Marcus stood in the doorway, unable to find anything that would change her mind. Before she left, she told him he always said the bank looked down on him, but maybe he was only holding on to that parcel because he wanted one day to stand above them. After she was gone, Marcus sat by himself in her empty room for a long time, the walls still marked with the outlines of posters she had taken down, the closet still smelling faintly of her perfume. He pulled the $150,000 contract out of the trash, smoothed it flat on her old desk, and sat with it until the tears came, quiet and unwelcome, the kind of grief he hadn't let himself feel since Denise died. He always believed the hardest part of all this would be enduring the bank's laughter. He understood now that the hardest part was watching his own daughter walk out the door over a decision he could not yet prove was right. If this story has kept you hooked so far, take 1 second to subscribe. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. Now things are about to change in a way nobody expected. 6 years later, in 2021, the bank's legal department sent Thomas a memo warning him directly that Parcel 7C could be the only legal access point for any future development, that Marcus still held clear ownership of, and that no project should be announced publicly until access was secured. The memo warned of serious delay risk if the bank moved forward without dealing with the parcel first, and it went so far as to recommend opening negotiations with Marcus quietly, long before any public announcement was ever made.
Thomas brushed the warning aside, telling one of his attorneys that Reed still owed the bank money, and once enough cash was on the table, the man would sign. When the attorney asked what would happen if he refused, Thomas answered without much thought that men like Marcus Reed did not turn down $500,000. He let the project keep moving forward without giving the board the full picture of the risk, sitting quietly along the eastern edge of State Route 9, confident that his own read on the situation was more reliable than anything written in a legal memo. That same year, the bank offered Marcus $350,000. He was nearly 62 years old by then, his health slower than it used to be, the house still needing more repairs than he could keep up with, and his relationship with Naya still distant after everything that had happened between them. He held the contract through an entire sleepless night, turning it over on the kitchen table more than once, and still could not bring himself to sign it. In the notebook where he tracked everything related to the parcel, Marcus wrote a single line that night: "The price keeps rising because they are starting to need it." Underneath that, he added one more thought, one that had been sitting unspoken in the back of his mind for years. The kind of question a man only lets himself ask in the middle of the night. What if he was right about the land, but wrong about his daughter? Early in 2024, Callaway Community Bank finally announced the full scope of what it had been building toward for nearly 2 decades, a $36 million development called Crossroads Commons. The plans called for a shopping center, residential housing, office space, restaurants, a grocery store, parking, and a main access road tying the entire project directly into State Route 9. Local news covered the announcement for days, describing it as the biggest thing to happen to Callaway County in a generation. Thomas appeared on local television calling it proof that people with real vision could turn an empty field into the future of Callaway County. Marcus heard those words on the old television set in a living room that still had not been fully repaired, the same ceiling that had once dripped rainwater on his daughter's bed, now patched but never quite matching the rest of the paint. The next morning, he drove straight to the county planning office and asked to see the project's access maps.
A clerk at the counter assumed he had come looking for construction work and asked if he needed the site foreman's number. Marcus told her he needed the access plans instead. When she asked, somewhat doubtfully, whether he actually understood how to read them, Marcus answered that he understood enough to know what they were missing. She pulled the file without much more conversation, clearly used to strangers wandering in with questions she did not expect to take seriously. Spread across the counter, the map showed the project's single main access road running directly through Parcel 7C. Without Marcus's consent, fire trucks could not meet code requirements for emergency access, the traffic plan could not be approved, building permits could not be finalized, construction financing could not be released, and retail tenants could not sign their final leases. Marcus stood there for a long moment, tracing the narrow strip on the map with one finger, feeling something shift quietly into place after 23 years of waiting. Marcus called Naya, now 32 years old and working as a real estate attorney, a career she had partly chosen so she could finally understand the paperwork that had consumed so much of her father's life. Part of her had gone into that field hoping to eventually prove him wrong, to sit across a table with men like Thomas and show her father that the world simply did not work the way he believed it did. For years, the two of them had mostly spoken only around holidays, their conversations polite but careful, like people stepping around something neither wanted to disturb. Marcus told her simply that he needed her to look at a map. Naya came home that same week, laid the project's access plan beside the original Parcel 7C deed, and checked the boundaries twice before she said anything, tracing the road with one finger, the same way her father had traced it years earlier in that same living room. "Their only road runs straight through your land," she finally told him. Marcus reminded her that he didn't own the project itself. Naya looked down at the narrow 12-foot strip and said quietly that he owned the door. For a moment, Marcus almost let himself believe this was the moment she would finally tell him he had been right all along, that all those years of waiting had just been vindicated in a single sentence. Instead, she closed the folder and told him this proved he had been right about the land, but it did not prove he had been right in how he treated her. Marcus nodded and did not try to defend himself. For the first time since the day she left, he finally admitted out loud that he had tried to protect her future without ever giving her the chance to understand it. A confession that came out slower and more carefully than anything he had said to her in years. Naya hadn't forgiven him, not yet, but she agreed to help him review the documents anyway, setting her own conditions for how involved she was willing to be. Whatever reconciliation might come between them was only just beginning, and neither of them pretended it would be quick or simple. Once the planning office required proof of legal access, Thomas had no choice but to summon Marcus to the bank directly. Even now, the front desk made him wait while men in suits were shown in ahead of him.
An old habit the bank still had not managed to break, though this time Marcus noticed the receptionist glancing at him with something closer to nerves than contempt. When Thomas finally called him back, he slid a check for $500,000 across the desk and told him it was more money than a man in his position could ever expect to earn in a lifetime. Marcus asked plainly what position that was supposed to mean. Thomas answered that it meant a retired laborer still living in a house that carried a mortgage with his bank. Marcus refused to sell the parcel outright. Instead, he offered the bank a right-of-way arrangement on his own terms, $6,000 a month, adjusted for inflation, lasting as long as the road existed, transferable to his heirs, with the bank covering all construction and maintenance costs, while Marcus retained full ownership of Parcel 7C. Thomas laughed in front of the board members gathered in the room and asked whether Marcus really expected the bank to pay back every single month the same amount he had once paid for the entire parcel. Marcus reminded him that in 2001, Thomas had asked whether he had $6,000 to spend. Now he said he was asking the bank the very same question. The laughter in the room stopped, and for the first time in over 2 decades, Marcus watched Thomas's confidence falter, even if only for a moment. Unable to force a sale through negotiation, the bank turned to pressure instead, and it came in stages rather than all at once.
First, Marcus's small business loan on his truck and equipment came due for renewal, and the bank suddenly reassessed his property value lower than before, denied an extension on his line of credit, cited his debt ratio and his age as risk factors, and moved his file into a separate risk management department. The letters arrived one after another over the course of several weeks, each one polite in tone and devastating in effect, until Marcus understood that the bank intended to squeeze him financially long before it ever took him back to court. Only after those weeks of financial pressure had worn him down did the story shift into the local press. Articles began describing Marcus as a man blocking hundreds of jobs, demanding unreasonable money, and exploiting a paperwork technicality to hold an entire community's future hostage. One story ran his photograph in his work clothes under the headline, "Retired Laborer Blocks $36 Million Project," and within days the story had been picked up by two other local outlets, each one repeating the same framing without ever calling him for comment. It was only in the days following that coverage, once public opinion had been given time to sour, that protesters began gathering outside his house, standing at the edge of his yard with signs demanding he let the project through. One evening a rock came through the window of what had once been Nia's bedroom, scattering glass across the floor she used to walk on barefoot as a child. Marcus swept up the broken pieces alone that night, his anger not really about the window at all, but about the empty room. It had shattered into the same room she had left years earlier over a decision he still could not fully explain to her. Even some of his old co-workers on the road crew, men who had known him for 20 years, started to go quiet around him after the headlines ran, unsure whether to believe what they had read or what they had personally seen of the man for 2 decades. Marcus noticed the change but said nothing about it, focusing instead on getting through each day without letting the noise outside change anything about the decision still sitting in front of him. Thomas did not stop there. He reached out directly to the law firm where Nia worked, a firm that held financial ties to Callaway Community Bank, and pressured them to force her off the case or risk losing her path to partnership. The partners called her into a private meeting and made the arrangement plain without ever quite saying it outright, that continuing to represent her father would not be looked upon kindly by the firm's most important client. Speaking to her privately afterward, Thomas told her that she had already escaped her father's kind of life and she should not let him drag her back down into it. Nia recognized immediately that Thomas still saw her father exactly the way he had in 2001, as someone who did not belong in rooms like this one, and now apparently he believed the same thing about her. She walked away from her own chance at partnership and stepped in as her father's official legal representative, packing up her office without much hesitation once the choice had been laid out so clearly in front of her. Still, she made her position clear to him. She told Marcus she stood with his right to the land, but that did not mean every wound between them had already healed. Marcus told her he didn't need her to forget any of it, he only needed the chance to do better starting now. A promise he made quietly, without any of the confidence he usually carried when he talked about the parcel. It was the most honest thing either of them had said to the other in years, and for the first time since she had walked out the door in 2015, something between them felt like it might still be repairable, even if neither of them said so directly. The bank's next move came through the courts. Attorneys for Callaway Community Bank filed for emergency temporary access to Parcel 7C, arguing that construction delays were already costing the project enormous sums of money and that the public interest outweighed one man's refusal to negotiate. This was not a final ruling on ownership, only a request to let machinery through while the larger dispute continued, but Marcus understood exactly what it would mean in practice if the judge agreed. If granted, bulldozers could cross Marcus's land immediately. The road could be built before the case was ever fully resolved.
The bank could then drag the ownership case out for years, confident that once the road existed, no court would ever order it torn back out, while Marcus risked losing his house before any final judgment ever came down at all. To support the motion, the bank produced a brand new survey claiming the original 2001 deed contained an error, that Parcel 7C actually sat 8 feet off from where everyone had assumed, and that the access road ran alongside Marcus's land rather than through it. The survey used a nearby utility
utility pole as its reference point, claiming the original iron stake from 1956 had rusted away and could no longer be relied upon, and that part of the county's old records had been damaged in a flood years earlier, leaving just enough uncertainty for the bank's attorneys to work with. At the first hearing, the judge found that the bank had shown a real risk of significant financial harm and gave Marcus 72 hours to produce more reliable evidence, warning that without it, temporary access would be granted. Marcus left the courthouse that afternoon feeling for the first time in over 2 decades that the ground beneath his feet was no longer as solid as he had always believed it to be, a feeling that followed him home and sat with him in dinner in silence. At almost the same moment, his own loan came due at the bank, tightening the pressure on him from 2 directions at once. Thomas delivered his final offer, $500,000, an end to any foreclosure proceedings against the house, and Marcus walking away from Parcel 7C entirely, with the agreement only taking effect once the funds and documents were placed into escrow before noon the following day. He set a deadline deliberately tight enough that Marcus would have almost no time to think it over or seek further advice. Marcus looked around at the house that still needed repairs. It might never get the broken window in his daughter's old room, still covered with plastic sheeting, and the stack of loan payments still hanging over Nia from her years in school. For a moment, he felt as though he had pulled his own daughter back into the very struggle she had once fought so hard to escape, and that thought alone felt heavier than anything Thomas had ever said to him across a desk. He signed the agreement. He handed it to Nia and told her to have it transferred into escrow the next morning. Nia looked at her father's signature for a long moment before he spoke again. "Maybe you were right," I admitted quietly. "Maybe I did not hold on to this land only for our future. Maybe part of me just wanted these people to finally admit they were wrong, and I let that need cost you more than I ever should have." Nia asked if he regretted buying the land at all. Marcus shook his head and told her his only regret was letting her believe, even for a moment, that the land had ever mattered more than she did. Nia did not tear up the agreement. She placed it carefully inside her bag instead, though. Something in the way she held the folder made Marcus wonder if she was already thinking further ahead than he was, turning over some idea she was not yet ready to share out loud. The agreement carried no legal weight until it was actually delivered into escrow, and until that happened, Parcel 7C still belonged to Marcus in every legal sense that mattered. That single fact was the only thing keeping them alive in this fight. Nia intended to use every hour of it. Nia asked her father one question before they moved any further. What exactly had he carried home the day he won that auction 23 years ago? Marcus thought of the fireproof box immediately. Together, they pulled it down from the closet shelf and spread its contents across the kitchen table, the same table where he had once shown Nia the map and called the parcel a door. Inside were the original deed, the $6,000 receipt, the 2001 survey, the engineer's field notes, and a corrected boundary addendum carrying Thomas Whitmore's own signature, sealed and dated years before anyone had reason to care about a narrow strip of grass. That addendum showed something the bank's new survey conveniently ignored. Before the sale had ever closed, the bank itself had caught a typographical error in the boundary description and corrected it through a stamped, signed document, the same document Thomas personally approved at the time. Nia reached out to Evelyn Price, the records clerk who had quietly set a glass of water in front of her at the auction all those years ago, and who had since retired from the bank entirely. Evelyn remembered this transaction clearly, even after so many years had passed. She was the one who had stamped the file, attached the addendum to the deed, kept a copy in the bank's own vault, and personally witnessed Thomas sign the title warranty. When Nia asked if she would testify, Evelyn agreed without much hesitation, telling her simply that she never knew how much that strip of land would end up being worth, but she remembered exactly how the room laughed the day Marcus bought it.
Nia hired an independent surveyor to settle the boundary question once and for all. Working from the original 1956 plan, he located a separate concrete monument buried near the old bridge,
a reference point the original engineers had set as backup in case the iron stake was ever lost, and one the bank's own survey team had never bothered to check. Measured from that concrete monument, rather than the utility pole the bank had relied on, the true boundary of Parcel 7C sat a full 8 feet away from where the bank claimed it did, a discrepancy the bank's own survey had conveniently left unexamined. That morning, Naya never delivered the signed agreement into escrow. Instead, she and Marcus walked into the emergency hearing together, carrying 23 years of paperwork between them. The reversals came one after another, each one chipping away at the bank's position a little further than the last. The bank's attorney presented their new survey first, insisting the road ran alongside Marcus's land rather than through it. Naya called her surveyor to the stand, and he explained plainly how the utility pole reference point ignored a legally established backup monument that predated it by decades. Measured correctly from that concrete monument, the access road for Crossroads Commons ran directly across the middle of Parcel 7C, exactly where it always had. The bank's attorney shifted his argument, claiming instead that the original 2001 deed contained an error significant enough to warrant a formal correction by the court. Naya produced the certified addendum showing the error had already been caught and fixed decades earlier, before ownership was ever transferred. Evelyn took the stand and confirmed under oath that she had personally stamped and filed that correction under Thomas's own direction, and the bank had no way to argue against its own seal. With both arguments gone, the bank's attorney called Thomas to testify. He claimed he did not remember the details of a small transaction with a seasonal laborer from 23 years earlier. Naya placed the title warranty in front of him and asked whether the signature on it belonged to him. He answered that it did. She continued without pause, asking whether the bank had received the full $6,000 from her father, whether Thomas had confirmed Parcel 7C as an independent standalone tract, and whether he had personally guaranteed the boundaries described in the attached survey. Each time, after a long moment of silence, Thomas answered yes. Naya let the last answer sit in the room before she spoke again. In 2001, she said, her father had been considered qualified enough for the bank to take his money. She asked why in 2024 he was suddenly not qualified enough for that same bank to honor his ownership. Thomas offered no response. Naya turned to face the judge and said plainly that Marcus Reed did not stand beneath the bank. He simply stood on the land the bank now needed. The judge did not rule on the full ownership dispute that day, but he found that the bank had failed to prove any legitimate right of access through Parcel 7C, and that its new survey relied on a reference point with no established legal standing. The request for temporary access was denied. The current boundaries would remain in place, no construction could proceed without a formal agreement with Marcus, and the disputed survey would be sent for independent professional review. Marcus had not won the entire case, but the bank had lost the one thing it needed most, the ability to start building immediately. Within days, the county planning office suspended the conditional permit for Crossroads Commons. Inspectors arrived at the site and posted a stop work order across the entrance gate. The bulldozers went silent. Workers packed up their equipment and left. Retailers who were ready to sign their final leases put everything on hold, and one major investor froze the next round of funding entirely, unwilling to keep pouring money into a project that could not legally move forward. Every day's delay cost the bank more in interest on construction loans and fees owed to contractors already under contract, and penalties from commercial tenants in mounting legal costs and incredibility with investors who had trusted Thomas's timeline. The board of directors opened an internal investigation and quickly found the 2021 memo warning Thomas that Parcel 7C represented a serious risk, a memo he had never shared in full with the rest of the board. The investigation confirmed that he had concealed that risk, leaned on Marcus's loan to apply pressure, and allowed construction to move forward without securing legal access. Thomas was suspended from his position while the investigation continued. With their strongest option gone and every additional week bleeding money the bank could not afford to lose, the board had no real option left but to negotiate directly and quickly. Dragging the case through years of litigation would cost far more than settling with Marcus ever could, especially with investors already threatening to withdraw if construction did not resume soon. Thomas was ordered to return to Marcus's house, this time alongside a representative of the board, and sit at the same kitchen table where he had once stood over Marcus after the storm in 2010, calling him foolish for refusing $40,000 while the ceiling still dripped above them. Thomas opened by calling $6,000 a month an unreasonable amount. Marcus did not repeat the line he had used weeks earlier. Instead, he told Thomas that he had once called him a man who understood nothing about real estate. Yet for 23 years, it was Thomas who never understood how much power a 12-foot strip of land could hold over a $36 million project. He slid the agreement across the table. The final terms held firm: $6,000 a month, adjusted for inflation, lasting as long as the road remained in use, transferable to his heirs, with the bank covering construction and maintenance costs and reasonable legal fees, while Marcus kept full ownership of Parcel 7C. His original loan was moved to an independent lender and refinanced at standard market terms, free from the bank's direct leverage for the first time in over 2 decades. Marcus did not walk away with every debt erased, and Naya still carried her own student loans, but the bank could no longer use either of their finances as a weapon.
Rather than demand a scholarship fund from the bank itself, Marcus chose instead to build one of his own, using part of the new income to establish the Denise Reed Fund, supporting the children of working single parents in the county. He told Nia that her mother had always believed whatever belonged to their family should be protected carefully, and that once they had more than they needed, it was time to open the door for someone else. The internal investigation concluded soon after, and Thomas Whitmore was forced to resign for concealing known risk and using the bank's financial leverage against a private landowner. Marcus's first payment arrived not long after, exactly $6,000, the same figure he had once handed over at auction with the whole room laughing at him. Nia placed the new receipt inside Denise's fireproof box, right beside the faded one from that first purchase, and told her father it had taken 23 years for that number to come back around. Marcus told her it had taken 23 years for them to understand everything it had cost along the way. I used that first payment to finally finish repairing the roof. He offered to pay off part of Nia's remaining student loans, though she refused to accept all of it, telling him plainly that he could not buy back the years they had spent not speaking to each other. He agreed and said quietly that what mattered now was making sure they stopped losing any more of it. From that point on, they began having dinner together every week, and while old wounds did not disappear overnight, Marcus no longer made decisions about either of their futures alone. At the rescheduled groundbreaking for Crossroads Commons, organizers offered Marcus a seat in the front row. He looked at the chair for a moment, then walked instead to stand beside Nia on the opposite side of State Route 9, where the first construction vehicles were finally crossing Parcel 7C under a new agreement bearing his own signature. When Nia asked why he had turned down the seat, Marcus told her he no longer needed anyone else to decide where he belonged. In 2001, the bank treated him as a man unfit to stand in their auction room. 23 years later, their entire project could not move an inch without his permission. Marcus had not won because he was wealthier than the bank. He had won because he saw further than they did, prepared more carefully than they ever bothered to, kept every paper they once dismissed, and outlasted every attempt to force his hand, understanding in the end that no victory means anything if it costs you your family along the way. People can look down on a person's job, their clothes, or where they came from, but none of that gives them the power to define the limits of someone's intelligence, patience, or dignity. Real worth is never found in the seat someone else offers you. It is found in what you build when no one believes in you at all. If Marcus's story reminded you that patience and quiet preparation can outlast any room of people underestimating you, we would love to have you back for the next one. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment below letting us know which moment hit you the hardest. If you were Marcus, would you have taken the $500,000 right away or held on to the land to protect your family's future?